Tun struggled against Zerk's thug, but to no avail. The pirate's arms seemed to be bands of steel and showed no sign of strain or even exertion as Tun's drive desperately against him. He watched, helpless, as another one of Zerk's cronies walked confidently over to Vitiv and roughly grabbed his arm. He began to pull him towards the door. He only made it one step. Kokotoka, seemingly having sprouted invisible wings, flew at the pirate like a dervish, ripping the man away from Vitiv and carrying him with momentum to the far wall, where the brief journey ended in a wet crunch. Now covered in gore, the nuisance, or saviour, Tunst mended, used his newfound avian abilities to spring atop the brute, holding Zerk, killing him with weight. Zerk's had already begun drawing his weapon. A flash of pale tan, where Tunst took several moments to realise that being Kokoto's arm shot through Tun's captor's neck, ripping it out completely. The loss of this rather important biological asset seemed to be too much for Tun's restrainer, and he expired in a gout of blood, which, to Tun's disgust, covered him. Tun's found he didn't mind at the moment, because at the same instant Tun's was covered in blood, he saw Zerk's, who was considered an extremely quick draw but seemed slow compared to Kokotogara, finally aimed his pulse pistol directly between the creature's eyes and remorselessly pulled the trigger. The gun fired. Nothing happened. The pulse slammed into Kokoto's face, and he didn't even move. Tun's jaw dropped until blood found its way into his mouth and popping eyes, and he started spluttering while trying to clear his vision. How had he survived that? Thought Tunsk. Never mind how he survived it. How did it not even touch him? Tunsk knew of no biological asset which would have allowed any living thing to survive a pulse pistol shot in the head at close range, let alone emerge completely unscathed, unless Kokoto's entire body was that strong. Tunsk finally managed to wipe his eyes clean and open them to an entirely new world. Zerk's was no longer standing in front of him, but lay prone upon the ground 5 meters from the doorway, minus his head, which appeared to prefer the company of the floor, rather than his neck. Even more terrifying was Kokotura. He was charging free of Zerk's henchmen. Tun's almost felt pity for them, as they fired round after accurate round into the enraged monster, striking him multiple times in the chest and head. The only thing their position achieved was further aggregation of Kokotura, until he was a veritable blur as he moved down the hallway, bellowing in hatred. The blur reached the group of panicked pirates, and a fine purple mist suddenly engulfed them. Tun suddenly remembered that the children were seeing this. Heck, he was seeing this! Tuns, with the help of Zurk and 2 of the older children, lifted the heavy door from where Kokotura had carefully placed it, on his own, and fitted it back into the doorframe, pushing and shifting it until it stayed without assistance. Tuns quickly turned off the lights so the room's occupants wouldn't have to look at the staring eyes of Kokotura's victims. Even though the sights were hidden, the door fitted in perfectly into the doorframe, couldn't block out the sounds. The screams of Xerxes, crew members, and frantic pulse pistol fire erupted from somewhere midship, but were silenced nearly as soon as it had begun. Their ordeal wasn't over yet, for several seconds after the screaming and shooting stopped, the entire ship shuddered, its hull emitting an ear-splitting crack. The door, which had essentially been balancing in the doorframe, was suddenly sucked flush back into position. Judging by the sounds coming from the other side, there'd been a major hull breach. "Why aren't the emergency force fields turning on?" asked Rook, who was nearly old enough to be trained as an engineer himself. "This ship's old," explained Dizzles, his face grim. "I'd be surprised if any of the emergency force fields or even half of the security force fields worked anymore." The moment he finished speaking, however, the door was suddenly released from its death grip upon the frame and probably fell to the floor for the second time that day. Tuns wished it hadn't. The ship, well, was there. It would have appeared disastrous enough with the copious amount of blood and entrails which seemed to have been thrown about the ship as though by a psychopathic interior decorator. With the hull breach having moved anything light that hadn't been bolted down, however, Tun's precious Krixer seemed to be as dead as his one-time co-owner, who now seemed to be attempting to introduce every millimeter of his blood to the floor as well. As Tuns picked his way through the wreckage, the carnage only intensified. Cargo Bay 9, which still bore the marks of Kookatura feeding himself, now appeared to be one of the cleanest areas of the ship. The docking bay was by far the worst. The walls appeared to be more purple than grey. The starboard airlock had been reduced to scrap, and the hull breach was being contained by... what the fuck? The medical bay door. Surrounded by it all, Kookatura stood in the middle of the docking bay, slumped in slight fatigue, holding a fusion blade of all things, and, Tz could have sworn, looking more pleased with himself than Tz had ever seen him before. Dear Journal, who the fuck am I kidding? I don't have a journal. I'm just narrating this in my head and prefacing it with Dear Journal because it helps me keep my verb tense and sentence structures the same. Why am I even bothering to narrate this? I should just stop. Okay, Journal. I'm sorry. Pretty please come back? Dear Journal, I'm a strategic genius. Oh, and I think I'm one of the good ones. To answer that last question, I swear I hadn't meant to make the ship look like that, and really, if we were going to point the finger at anyone, then it would have mostly been Twinkletoast's fault. I wasn't the one that shot a drilling laser at the bulkhead of the ship which was keeping all the oxygen in. I may have been the reason that he pulled the trigger, but I can't be blamed for others' actions. I heard myself coming up with all these excuses, as Severus surveyed my handiwork with the slack-jawed expression of a cow staring down a semi on the interstate. My fears were unwarranted, however. I won't recount all the disgustingly heartfelt details, but apparently the Blue Giraffes figured out why I had done it. At least I think Mama knew it right away and had to enlighten Severus. That guy did not have the intellect of his namesake. The worst part about their thanks was when I discovered that their equivalent of a hug involved twisting their neck around that of the fortunate recipient. My neck wasn't quite as flexible as theirs, and when I tried to replicate the quarter twist movement they were demonstrating, I ended up nearly crushing Severus's windpipe between my chin and shoulder. Once that misunderstanding was cleared up, I settled for just standing there awkwardly while they twisted their necks around mine in a brief hug, looking as though I was on the receiving end of the strangest and most inefficient attempt to strangle someone. I considered adding a new definition to the term necking to Urban Dictionary when I got home. Home. That thought sure put a dampener on my mood. Once the Blue Giraffe necking sessions were over, those who had been taking cover in the engine room began looking for survivors throughout the ship. I guess the weapons the pirates had been using weren't that powerful even by alien standards. Thank goodness. And the only wounds that were fatal were those to the chest or head. There was still an alarming number of such wounds. Only a third of the crew had survived, and of those, half were unable to work. That made the task of restoring the ship back to working order nigh impossible. Wouldn't you know it? There seemed to be a bigger, better cargo ship docked to our port airlock whose previous owners showed a decided lack of interest in its continued use. Not wanting to waste such a generously given, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the crew readily relocated into their newly acquired vessel. There was very little to move from our cargo bays, as most had been destroyed when their holding crates toppled over during the hull breach. Only a few commodities which were stored in such heavy crates that they had not been affected by the sudden redirection of atmospheric pressure had survived, as well as some oddly coloured crates which Mama had seemed to fawn over. There were so few things to move that even the few crews still able to work were able to transfer everything in 2 trips. I had been meaning to help, but by the time I saw how they used the larger versions of the crate transportation bed that Dink had used to move my bath, they were finished. I thought about pushing one of the Blue Giraffes aside and forcing them to see me help working, but decided that if I was going to attack one of them in order to prove I was sapient, I might as well just enslave them. I considered that for a moment too, but then rejected it out of principle. Once they settled the wounded, transported the cargo, and completed logistics, the crew looked more tired than I was, which wasn't saying much, so I revised that by saying they looked darn tuckered out. They were done working for the day, and the crew that wasn't sleeping or tending wounded were relaxing in the common lounge, just one of the creature comfort rooms that the last ship had lacked. I walked in just as 2 Blue Giraffes I had not yet had the pleasure of naming were sitting down at a table with a familiar silver clam between them. Eager to watch real, blue giraffe chess players at work. I pulled a chair up to the table and stood on top of it, so I was tall enough to see the game board from above. The two players, one which I named Dippy, on account of his face's natural expression, and the other Whip, on account of his physique, at first looked at me in curiosity, then in amusement, as I gazed upon the glowing board. They probably thought I was mesmerised by the pretty lights. Morons. Hey, check it out. Cocoteur's mesmerised by the pretty lights. Strick, you're a moron. The game started, and I could immediately see both players were better than Dink and Jiggles. Then I started seeing their mistakes. Whip seemed marginally decent, but Dippy was only better than Jiggles because he planned a couple moves ahead. Neither seemed to be using the board's programming to their advantage, and both failed to deploy their pieces in formations utilising even half their potential. It was a game of patterns, and these two were painting the board like toddlers given a year's supply of crayons and a blank white wall. It was better than Dink and Jiggles, but it was their 3-year-old crayon scribbles to Dink and Jiggles' gameplay which held the elegance of a chipmunk, dunked in paint, and then set free on an acre of acorns. After they finished their first game, which took 3 times as long as it should have, they started a second game. Not being able to bear the thought of watching them blunder through another travesty of a game, I decided to enlighten them with a didactic demonstration. Flicking Dippy's hand away, a slap might have injured him, which had been about to move perhaps the only piece on the board placed correctly. I tried to move a hollow token that was so far out of position that for all intents and purposes, it might as well be dead. My hand went right through the board without interacting with the piece. Apparently you had to be a blue giraffe for the clam to allow you to interact with the pieces. Whip and Dippy were making odd noises and shaking in their seats. Laughing at me, were they? I looked Dippy in the eye, pointed to the offering piece, and then pointed to where it should go. His laughter increased. Exasperated, I grabbed his hand and forced it to move the piece. That got his attention. Both idiots goggled at me as the board registered Dippy's move. I signalled Whip to take his. They couldn't take the move back, so Whip moved his piece, looking at Dippy apologetically and clicking something. Dippy glanced at me nervously and slowly started to move his hand to the same piece, which didn't need moving. I grabbed it again and forced it to another woefully placed piece. Now the players were getting mad, clicking at me in anger and making shooing motions with their hands, and there I stood, not understanding a word of it. Whip took his turn again, and the moment he finished, Dippy flung his hand towards one of the pieces I had just moved, trying to put it back out of position. He wasn't fast enough, and I grabbed his hand before it could touch the board, forcing it to do my bidding. Dippy went into a frenzy, and Whip made a motion as though to close the clam. I blocked his hand, then glared at him, willing him to take his turn. Anger now replaced with fear, Whip complied. Not even bothering to let go of Dippy's hand, I took his next few turns for him. Then a hex lit up. I had barely managed to get the bare minimum of Dippy's pieces into what I thought to be a decent position, but the results were noticeable. The hex was a full 3 spaces closer to several of Dippy's pieces than it had ever been. Whip and Dippy blinked. Whip's pieces were out of position, and I easily managed to get a piece onto the hex before he could stop me. I just needed to do that 6 more times before I could win. Dippy's reluctance to allow me to borrow the use of his appendage evaporated, and I was able to move my pieces without hindrance. 6 more hexes lit up, and for each one I managed to get there before Whip could stop me. It really wasn't that hard of a game. So long as I had enough pieces to narrow down the possibilities, I could reasonably guess which hex would light up next. After I moved Dippy's hand in his first victory move, I looked into their dumbfounded faces. One of these days I'm going to introduce you to a real strategy game. It's called chess,